A couple of years ago, I made a video around the Halloween season discussing creepypastas, and I discussed some of the five or four most important creepypastas out there, like Jeff the Killer and the Polybius theory. But that video was actually used to create a more explained thing, as I was ultimately going to use it to create a tier list video of me finally going back and re-ranking certain creepypastas. And well, since it is the Halloween season, I decided why not continue it and at least finalize it. So yeah, I decided to create another video of me reading famous creepypastas. And in today's video, I have a couple of good ones. Zalgo, Eyeless Jack, The Russian Sleep Experiment, Herobrine, and 1999 will all be covered, as I will be reading them verbatim. Yes, I will be giving a full explanation of me reading these stories, however long they are, whether it's 10 minutes or 30 minutes, you're gonna be here with me. And of course, I will give a small explanation, but ultimately I will be saving some details and some opinions for the big, ultimate tier list that I have surrounding the creepypasta. So with all that being said, let's get into it. Forgive the length of this message. This is the first and possibly the last time I'll have access to a computer, so I thought I'd better write this all down while I can, and get it to those who should know. I'm leaving town. I don't know where I'm going. I'm just getting as far away as I can. Okay, so as some of you may know, I took out a loan and opened my own auto shop a little over a year ago. Business has been going decently well. I can't complain, and I've always been grateful to all of my customers who would come to me exclusively when God knows there are so many already established places in town. I've been doing well enough that I was able to hire on my buddy Neil a few months ago, and he's been working hard and helping out really well, as I always knew he would. Well, I needed to take a day and go to a Lemaze class with Rebecca last month, and so I entrusted the shop to Neil for the morning and most of the afternoon. That's the day I think everything actually started, because when I got back, he seemed to be in a stupor and was covered in oil. He'd even had some smeared across his face, as if he'd tried to drink it or something. I told him to go home and clean himself up because we had no clients at the moment, and I could take care of anyone who came in for the time being. He came back 45 minutes later, but he was still much quieter than usual. He worked as well as he ever did, but something just seemed off about him. I asked him if anything happened while I was out, and he just shook his head. I asked how many clients we had, and he just muttered something unintelligible. I asked him to repeat himself, and he turned out and glared at me, and for the briefest moment, I could have swore his eyes appeared to be completely black. No iris, no sclera, just utter all-consuming blackness. I stumbled back and bumped a shelf, knocking things down. When I looked back at him, he was still looking at me, but he didn't seem to be glaring hatefully the way he had before. He just seemed kind of out of it. "Just a couple," he answered. "Some woman and then a tattooed biker type looking dude. I assumed one of them must have asked for an oil change, and that's when he spilled it. So I asked if he had any trouble, and he simply shrugged. I had looked all around the garage while he was gone, and I saw no traces of an oil spill. So whatever had happened, he must have gotten it all on himself and none of it anywhere else. Miraculously, but he seemed reluctant to talk about it, so I didn't press the issue, and we worked on throughout the day. That day and the next were relatively normal, other than him still being awkward and quiet. I asked him if he'd like to go out and get us lunch while I tended the shop, and he said sure. When he came back, I was busy doing a diagnostic for a client, so he put the food on the counter in the office to wait for me, and he went ahead and ate. I finished up with that customer. We'd had to keep her car overnight to figure out just why it kept dying on her. So I asked Neil to give her a ride home, and then I went to grab my food. He'd brought Chinese food and an iced tea, so I opened the soy sauce packets to pour some over my food when I noticed the strangest thing. It was as if the soy sauce was a living thing somehow, spreading but like dozens of squirming, inky, black maggots when it fell into the fried rice and burying itself inside. I took the fork and started to scoop out the rice to look deeper inside, and small smoky tendrils would rise from the rice occasionally and dissipate. I was incredibly hungry at that point, but I was way too creeped out to eat that, so I chucked it out and the iced tea in the garbage, and decided I'd just wait till I got home that evening to eat something I prepare with my own hands. I never in my life seen anything remotely like that, and I couldn't even fathom how I would ask Neil if he had noticed anything similar. As cold and distant as he had been lately, I was sure he'd look at me like I was Looney Tunes, so I just shut up about it. That Friday, we went down to the old watering hole as we always do to get some drinks and watch the local bands play. And Neil was just as quiet and distant as he had been all week. He's not a bad-looking fellow, though, and some despite him not really going out of his way to speak to anyone. A woman went over to where he was sitting and started talking to him, and they ended up leaving together that night. Monday morning, I tried breaking the ice by asking how his weekend went, and he gave me a nod and muttered, "Alright." I asked him if he got lucky with that young woman I saw him with, and he gave me the smallest grin, which was quite possibly the first grin I'd seen on him face in a week, and said it went well. I didn't pressure him for details. I knew he'd shared if he chose to, and his small grin was enough to assuage my worries and lend me some hope that he might be back to his old self. The day was relatively busy until about 3 p.m., so I finally had a spare moment to sit in the office and listen to the radio. While I waited on the next client, so there I was, leaning back in my chair with my feet propped up on my desk, when I swiveled around and looked at my bulletin board that sits behind my head with all manner of clippings stuck to it. I had a few Sunday comic strips such as Garfield and Calvin and Hobbes that I had read maybe 100 times since I'd opened shop there, but that day something was different. The first panel seemed normal, but in each subsequent panel, inky black tendrils crept out before the edges of the frame and from behind the characters. Blood dripped from the ears and eyes and sometimes even their nose, and in each of the strips, one of the characters would say, "He comes." I sat staring in astonishment for a moment before I realized that the tendrils were moving ever so slowly, and then each of the characters' heads turned ever so slowly towards me, and I threw myself back away from the bulletin board, sliding over my desk and onto the floor. I ran out into the garage and yelled for Neil. I would not be the only one to see this. To my surprise, he had gone, and so I hesitantly walked back to the office and peered inside. The comics were still corrupted, but they no longer appeared to be moving. I crept over to it and reached out to pluck one of the comics free when I noticed the inky black tendrils starting to seep across the page towards where my fingers were at least 3 times as fast as they moved before, and I jerked my hand away. Nothing good could possibly come from letting that blot of ink touch my skin. Of course, I ripped the entire bulletin board down, burned it in a tin trash can out back, and never spoke of it again. That night, I went home and my wife was already in bed, fast asleep. My mind was racing and I couldn't even bring myself to eat dinner that night. With no one to vent my worries to, I fell into a restless sleep and kept awaking to nightmares after nightmares, seemingly every hour of the night until I just gave up on sleep entirely. That Friday, I went to the bar again. Even though my wife couldn't drink, being pregnant and all, and Neil wasn't really any fun to hang out with anymore, and none of my other friends could seem to be reached, I just needed to get a good buzz and I'd start feeling better, I reckoned. After downing a couple of beers, I excused myself to the restroom when I noticed I was more inebriated than I estimated, so I leaned over to the sink to splash some water onto my face, and that's when I heard it. Like a sheet of fabric being dragged across a floor, a voice rasped ever so quietly out of the drain. It sounded like a prolonged exhale for the longest time until I finally recognized words hidden amongst all of those vowels. "He comes." Cracks appeared in the porcelain, shaking out from the ring around the drain. At least they looked like cracks at first, but after a few seconds, I recognized them as the same tendrils of corruption I seen in the comics earlier that week, shaking their way slowly along. I stumbled backwards out of the bathroom door and right into someone's chest. I turned around and stared up into the pitch black eyes of a 6.5-foot biker with tattoos covering every piece of exposed skin besides his hands and head. I stumbled quickly away from him, and his evil piercing gaze followed me as I retreated through the bar. It felt like a dream, where whenever you're running for your life, it feels like running through quicksand. As I walked across the room, I noticed that the biker wasn't the only one staring at me. It seemed every pair of eyes in the place were focused on me, and more than half of those eyes appeared to be perfectly black, with no hint of iris or sclera. A few lips moved, and though I couldn't hear their voices over the sound of the jukebox, I could easily guess what they were saying. He comes. I didn't get a week of sleep that night. I haven't been getting much sleep for the past couple of weeks, as a matter of fact, which I'm guessing those of you who've spoken to me recently could have guessed. I keep seeing those pitch black eyes staring at me. I'm afraid every one of the ones I see will turn and whisper those words to me, staring deep into my soul with that evil glare. Every time I go near a sink or go to grab a bite to eat, I'm afraid I'll see those inky snaking tendrils squiggling towards me. Even my wife has seemed cold and distant lately. Then tonight, as I'm driving home from work, struggling to keep my eyes open so that I don't drift into oncoming traffic, my cell phone rang and it was Rebecca. She was on her way to the hospital to have our baby, and for the first time in 2 weeks, I was actually happy. She was in labor room, strapped to a monitor when I got there, watching for her contractions. She barely noticed when I walked in, but didn't seem startled when I sat down beside her and took her hand in mine. I tried talking to her, but she was unresponsive, and I was so tired I didn't even realize I had started to drift off to sleep until the nurses came in and started moving her to the delivery room about a half an hour later. I put on my scrubs and a hairnet and went in with her to hold her hand and coach her through like they trained us in Lamaze. When she started cursing and screaming, I was prepared for that, as well as her ever-tightening grip on my hand, but when I saw the movement in her tummy, my mind started to reel. The doctor said that the baby was crowning and told her to push. I echoed his orders and she screamed at me with a voice I couldn't begin to describe. When I looked down at her, she was staring up at me with those same eyes I'd seen on the biker. The same eyes I thought I'd seen on Neil weeks before. I tried to jerk my hand away, but she maintained her grip. Black tar-like blood splashed the front of the doctor's scrubs, but he seemed to pay no heed. When I looked at her tummy again, black veins seemed to stand out beneath her skin, pulsating. She continued to stare at me, and she was no longer screaming, just grinning, those obsidian eyes boring into me to invoke the Nesperadin hive mind of chaos. She breathed in a raspy voice. "He who waltzed behind the wall." The doctor continued as he stared down at the child, my child, lying silently, cradled in his blood-stained hands. He looked up and raised the baby, and it appeared to be covered in oozing, inky black liquid, much like that had covered Neil a couple of weeks prior. It did not cry out, but it was alive, and it moved when he was held up. When his eyes opened, they were as black as my wife's, as black as the doctor's. In unison, they all breathed his name, Zalgo. I ripped my hand free of my wife's iron grip and stumbled out of the room, barreling into the nurses passing into the corridor just outside. When I stood up and looked back into the room, I could see the inky black tendrils seeming to extend from the doctor and my newborn across the floor to where I stood. I turned and ran down the hall to the elevator and slammed my finger into the buttons. When I looked back, the tendrils had come into the hallway, yet no one else seemed to notice until it slithered over their feet and up their legs, at which point they abruptly stopped, turned and looked at me with those same obsidian eyes. I abandoned my effort to call the elevator and broke into a panicked run for the stairs. I ran down the 15 flights of stairs all the way to the lobby, tore ass out into the parking lot, hopped in my car and just started driving. I didn't know where the fuck I was going, I just had to get the fuck away from there. I don't know if I'm going crazy, it certainly seems like it, but I just can't be around anyone I know anymore. They all have those eyes. The same eyes and those same dead stares that even my child, oh god, my baby. I still saw those eyes staring at me from the cars beside me, and by some strange coincidence, the same biker from the previous Friday night at the bar pulled up beside me an hour away from the hospital and followed me for nearly 2 miles. He turned and stared at me, grinning. I couldn't see his eyes through his sunglasses this time, but I knew it was the same guy. His tattoos seemed to move off their own free will. The flaming skull on his right bicep began bleeding from its eye sockets. As soon as I could, I slammed on my brakes, allowing him to fly past me as I swerved to my left and did a U-turn. I think I lost him. That was about an hour ago. I'm at a motel 3 hours out of the town, the first place I found that has Wi-Fi, and I'm tired. I'm shaking and my hand itches where my wife's nail scratched me open. I honestly don't know what to do or who I can turn to. This story will sound insane and I'd probably be institutionalized, and I'm not sure that wouldn't be the best thing for me, but I just can't bear to look at those eyes anymore. Every time I see someone new and they stare at me, I start to panic because I just know it's out there looking for me, whatever it is. And even when I lay down, I start to drift off to sleep. I hear those words. He comes. Hello, my name is Mitch. I'm here to tell you guys about an experience I had. I don't know if it was paranormal or whatever, stupid words people use to describe supernatural phenomena, but after that thing visited me, I believe in the paranormal trash. A week after I moved in with my brother Edwin, after my house was foreclosed, I finished unpacking. Edwin liked the idea of moving in since we had been not seeing each other for like 10 years, so I was excited too. I soon fell asleep after I moved in. After the first week, I heard rustling noises coming from the outside at about 1 in the morning. I thought it was a raccoon, so I ignored it and tried to fall asleep. The next morning, I told Edwin about it, and he agreed. The next night, however, I thought I heard something in my window opening and a loud thump, as if something entered my room. I darted up and looked around my room, but I saw nothing. The next morning, though, Edwin dropped his coffee cup when he saw me. He held up a nearby mirror and I saw myself. I had a large gash in my left cheek. After I was rushed to the hospital, my doctor told me that I must have been sleepwalking, but then he showed me something that made my blood turn cold. He lifted up my shirt to reveal a sewn-up incision where my kidneys were. I stared into his eyes, mine widening. "You somehow lost your left kidney last night." My doctor told me, "We don't know how, though. Sorry, Mitch." The next night was my breaking point. Around midnight, I woke up to see a truly horrifying sight. I was staring face to face with a creature with a black hoodie and a dark blue mask with no nose or mouth staring down at me. That thing scared me with the most that I've ever seen, and that it also had no eyes, just empty black sockets. The creature had also some black substance dripping from its sockets. I grabbed a camera from the nearby mantle and took a picture. Immediately after the shot, the creature lunged at me and tried to claw open my chest to get my lungs. I stopped it by kicking it in the face. As I ran out of my room, I grabbed my wallet. I would need the money. I ran out of my brother's house into the night. I eventually ended up in the woods near Edwin's house and tripped on a rock. I fell unconscious and woke up in the hospital. My doctor, the same one who treated me before, entered the room. "I have good news and bad news, Mitch," my doctor started. "The good news is that you had minor injuries and your parents are going to pick you up." I sighed with relief. "The bad news is that your brother has been killed by something. Sorry." My parents took me back to Edwin's house to collect my remaining belongings, which I did. Upon entering my room, I was scared but remained calm. I grabbed my camera and then stopped dead in my tracks in the same hallway leading to my room. I saw Edwin's body and something small lying next to it. I retrieved it up and entered my parents' car. Not mentioning Edwin's corpse, I looked at the thing and I had picked and nearly vomited. I was holding my stolen half-eaten kidney with some black substance on it. Russian researchers in the late 1940s kept 5 people awake for 15 days using an experimental gas-based stimulant. They were kept in sealed environment to carefully monitor their oxygen intake so the gas didn't kill them. Since it was toxic in high concentrations, this was before closed-circuit cameras, so they had only microphones and 5-inch thick glass porthole-sized windows into the thick chamber to monitor them. The chamber was stocked with books, cots to sleep on but no bedding, running water and toilet, and enough dried food to call all 5 for over a month. The test subjects were political prisoners deemed enemies of the state during World War II. Everything was fine for the first 5 days. The subjects hardly complained, having been promised that they would be freed if they submitted to the test and did not sleep for 30 days. Their conversations and activities were monitored, and it was noted that they continued to talk about increasingly traumatic incidents in their past, and the general tone of their conversation took on a darker aspect after the 4th day mark. After 5 days, they started to complain about the circumstances and events that led to them where they were and started to demonstrate severe paranoia. They stopped talking to each other and began alternatively whispering to the microphones and one-way mirrored portholes. Oddly, they all seemed to think that they could win the trust of the experimenters by turning over their comrades, the other subjects in captivity with them. At first, the researchers suspected this was an effect of the gas itself. After 9 days, the first of them started screaming. He ran the length of the chamber repeatedly, yelling at the top of his lungs for 3 hours straight. He continued attempting to scream but was only able to produce occasional squeaks. The researchers postulated that he had physically torn his vocal cords. The most surprising thing about this behavior is how the other captives reacted to it, or rather didn't react to it. They continued whispering to the microphones until the second of the captives started to scream. The 2 non-screaming captives took the books apart, smearing page after page with their own feces, and pasted them calmly over the glass portholes. The screaming promptly stopped. So did the whispering to the microphones. After 3 more days passed, the researchers checked the microphones hourly to make sure they were working, since they thought it impossible that no sound could be coming with 5 people inside. The oxygen consumption in the chamber indicated that all 5 must still be alive. In fact, it was the amount of oxygen 5 people would consume at a very heavy level of strenuous exercise. On the morning of the 14th day, the researchers did something they said they would not do to get a reaction from the captives. They used the intercom inside the chamber, hoping to provoke any response from the captives that they were afraid were either turned vegetables or dead. They announced, "We are opening up the chambers to test the microphones. Step away from the door and lie flat on the floor or you will be shot. Compliance will earn one of you your immediate freedom." To their surprise, they heard a single phrase in a calm voice response, "We no longer want to be freed." Debate broke out among the researchers and the military forces funding the research. Unable to provoke any more response using the intercom, it was finally decided to open the chamber at midnight on the 15th day. The chamber was flushed of the stimulant gas and filled with fresh air, and immediately voices from the microphones began to object. 3 different voices began begging, as if pleading for the life of loved ones, to turn the gas back on. The chamber was open and soldiers sent in to retrieve the test subjects. They began to scream louder than ever, and so did the soldiers when they saw that was inside. 4 of the 5 subjects were still alive, although no one could rightfully call the state that any of them were in. We don't know if they were even alive. The food rations past day 5 had not been so much as touched. There were chunks of meat from the dead test subjects' thighs and chest stuffed into the drain in the center of the chamber, blocking the drain and allowing 4 inches of water to accumulate on the floor. Precisely how much of the water on the floor was actually blood was never determined. All 4 surviving test subjects also had large portions of muscle and skin torn away from their bodies. The destruction of flesh and exposed bone on their fingertips indicated that the wounds were inflicted by hand, not with teeth as the researchers initially thought. Closer examination of the position and angles of the wounds indicated that most of it, not all of them, were self-inflicted. The abdominal organs below the ribcage of all 4 test subjects had been removed. While the heart, lungs, and diaphragm remained in place, the skin and most of the muscles attached to the ribs had been ripped off, exposing the lungs through the ribcage. All the blood vessels and organs remained intact. They had just been taken out and laid on the floor, fanning out around the eviscerated but still living bodies of the subjects. The digestive tract of all 4 could be seen to be working, digesting food. It quickly became apparent that what they were digesting was their own flesh that they had ripped off and eaten over the course of days. Most of the soldiers were Russian special operatives at the facility, but still many refused to return to the chamber to remove the test subjects. They continued to scream to be left in the chamber and alternately begged and demanded that the gas be turned back on, lest they fall asleep. To everyone's surprise, the test subjects put on a fierce fight in the process of being removed from the chamber. One of the Russian soldiers died from having his throat ripped out. Another was gravely injured by having his testicles ripped off and an artery in his leg severed by one of the subject's teeth. Another 5 of the soldiers lost their lives if you count ones that committed suicide in the weeks following the incident. In the struggle, one of the 4 living subjects had his spleen ruptured and he bled out almost immediately. The medical researchers attempted to sedate him, but this proved impossible. He was injected with more than 10 times the human dose of morphine derivative and still fought like a cornered animal, breaking the ribs and arms of one doctor when heart was seen to beat for a full 2 minutes after he had bled out to the point that there was no air in his vascular system than blood. Even after it stopped, he continued to scream and flail for another 3 minutes, struggling to attack anyone in reach and just repeating the word "more" over and over, weaker and weaker, until he finally fell silent. The surviving 3 test subjects were heavily restrained and moved to a medical facility. The 2 with intact vocal cords continuously begging for the gas, demanding to be kept awake. The most injured of the 3 was taken to the only surgical operating room that the facility had. In the process of preparing the subject to have his organs placed back within his body, it was found that he had effectively immune to the sedative that is given to him to prepare him for the surgery. He fought furiously against his restraints when the anesthetic gas was brought out to put him under. He managed to tear most of the way through a 4-inch wide leather strap on one wrist, even though the weight of a 200-pound soldier was holding that wrist as well. It only took a little more anesthetic than normal to put him under, and the instant his eyelids fluttered and closed, his heart stopped. In the autopsy of the test subject that died on the operating table, it was found that his blood had tripled the normal levels of oxygen. His muscles that were still attached to his skeleton were badly torn, and he had broken 9 bones in his struggle to not be subdued. Most of them were from the force his own muscles had exerted on them. The second survivor had been the first of the group of 5 to start screaming. His vocal cords destroyed, he was unable to beg or object to surgery, and he had only reacted by shaking his head violently in disapproval when the anesthetic gas was brought near him. He shook his head yes when someone suggested. Reluctantly, they tried the surgery without anesthetic, and did not react for the entire 6-hour procedure of replacing his abdominal organs and attempting to cover them with what remained of his skin. The surgeon presiding stated repeatedly that it should be medically impossible for the patient to still be alive. One terrified nurse assisting the surgery stated that she had seen the patient's mouth curl into a smile several times whenever his eyes met hers. When the surgery ended, the subjects looked at the surgeon and began to wheeze loudly, attempting to talk while struggling. Assuming that this might be some of drastic importance, the surgeon had a pen and kept fetched so the patient could write his message. It was a simple, "Keep cutting." The other 2 subjects were given the same surgery, both without anesthetic as well. Although they had to be injected with a paralytic for the duration of the operation, the surgeon found it impossible to perform the operation while the patients laughed continuously. Once paralyzed, the subjects could only follow the attending researchers with their eyes. The paralytic cleared their system in an abnormally short period of time, and they were soon trying to escape their bonds. The moment they could speak, they were again asking for the stimulant gas. The researchers tried asking why they had injured themselves, why they had ripped out their own guts, and why they wanted to be given the gas again. Only one response was given: "I must remain awake." All 3 subjects' restraints were reinforced and they were placed back into the chamber, awaiting determination as to what should be done with them. The researchers facing the wrath of the military benefactors for having failed the stated goals of their project considered euthanizing the surviving subjects. The commanding officer, a former KGB agent, instead saw potential and wanted to see what would happen if they were put back on the gas. The researchers strongly objected but were overruled. In preparation for being sealed in the chamber again, the subjects were connected to an EEG monitor and had their restraints padded for long-term confinement. To everyone's surprise, all 3 stopped struggling the moment it was let slip that they were going back on the gas. It was obvious that at this point, all 3 were putting up a great struggle to stay awake. One of the subjects that could speak was humming loudly and continuously. The mute subject was straining his legs against the leather bonds with all his might, first left, then right, then left again for something to focus on. The remaining subject was holding his head off his pillow and blinking rapidly. Having been the first to be wired for EEG, most of the researchers were monitoring his brain waves in surprise. They were normal most of the time, but sometimes flatlined inexplicably. It looked as if he were repeatedly suffering from brain damage before returning back to normal. As they focused on papers scrolling out of the brainwave monitor, only one nurse saw his eyes slip shut at the same moment his head hit the pillow. His brainwaves immediately changed to that of a deep sleep, then flatlined for the last time as his heart simultaneously stopped. The only remaining subject that could speak started screaming to be sealed in now. His brainwaves showed the same flatlines as one who had just died from falling asleep. The commander gave the order to seal the chamber with both subjects inside, as well as 3 researchers. One of the named 3 immediately drew his gun and shot the commander point blank between the eyes, then turned the gun on the mute subject and blew his brains out as well. He pointed his gun at the remaining subject, still restrained to a bed as the remaining members of the medical and research team fled the room. "I won't be locked in here with these things, not with you," he screamed at the man strapped to the table. "What are you?" he demanded. "I must know." The subject smiled. "Have you forgotten so easily?" the subject asked. "We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be free at every moment in your deepest animal mind. We are what you hide from in your beds every night. We are what you sedate in silence and paralysis when you go to the nocturnal heaven where we cannot tread." The researcher paused and aimed at the subject's heart and fired. The EEG flatlined as the subject weakly choked out. So nearly free. I had recently spawned a new world in single-player Minecraft. Everything was normal at first, as I began chopping down trees and crafting a workbench. I noticed something move amongst the dense fog. I have a very slow computer, so I have to play with a tiny render distance. I thought it was a cow, so I pursued it, hoping to grab some hides for armor. It wasn't a cow though. Looking back at me was another character with default skin, but his eyes were empty. I saw no name pop up, and I double checked to make sure I was in a multiplayer mode. He didn't stay long. He looked at me and quickly ran into the fog. I pursued out of curiosity, but he was gone. I continued on with the game, not sure what to think. As I expanded the world, I saw things that seemed out of place for the random map generator to make. 2x2 tunnels in the rocks, small perfect pyramids made of the sand in the ocean, and groves of trees with all their leaves cut off. I could constantly think I saw the other player in the deep fog, but I never got a better look at him. I tried increasing my render distance to far whenever I thought I saw him, but it was to no avail. I saved the map and went on the forums to see if anyone else had found the pseudo player. There were none. I created my own topic telling of the man and asking if anyone had a similar experience. The post was deleted within 5 minutes. I tried again and the topic was deleted even faster. I received a PM from a user named Herobrine containing one word, stop. When I went to look at Herobrine's profile, the page 404'd. I received an email from another forum user. He claimed the mods can read the forum user messages, so we were safe for using email. The emailer claimed that he had seen the mystery player too, and that he had a small directory of other users who had seen him as well. Their worlds were littered with obviously man-made features as well and described their mystery player to have no pupils. About a month passed until I heard from the mystery informant again. Some of the people who had encountered the mystery man had looked into the name Herobrine and found out that the name to be frequently used by a Swedish gamer. After some further information gathering, it was revealed to be the brother of Notch, the game's developer. I personally emailed Notch and asked him if he had a brother. It took him a while, but he emailed me back a very short message. I did, but he is no longer with us. I haven't seen the mystery man since our first encounter, and I haven't noticed any changes to the world other than my own. I was only able to press print screen when I first saw him. Here's the only evidence of this existence. The year is 1999. That sentence brings me back to my senior kindergarten class when I was 5 years old, where we used to read out the date on the blackboard every single day. The year 1999 exists as a stain in my mind. However, as a memory that will not go away no matter how I try to forget it, 1999 marked the year I lost my first tooth, my first time on a plane, and unfortunately, the early loss of my childhood innocence. That one memory that refuses to be wiped, it all started with that new TV. At the time, Pokemon was the latest fad to hit the school. Pokemon cards, games, stickers, and the most popular, the TV show. So of course every time I came home from the school I would stay glued to the TV until Pokemon came on at 5. The only problem was that my dad watched the news at 5:30 and Pokemon episodes were back to back, which meant I had to miss an episode every day. Something I whined on and on about. My dad got tired of hearing me complain every day. That must be why he went and bought another TV. My dad put the TV he bought in my room. Unfortunately, it was just an old, small boob tube, with rabbit ears even. It also only had 20 channels available, not including the channel Pokemon was on. I recall I didn't care though. I was just thrilled I had my own TV in my room. After surfing through the channels, I came to the conclusion that only Channel 2, TVO Kids, was worth watching, so I watched that for a while. It wasn't for another few months until I discovered Channel 21. One day in April, I was flipping through the channels trying to see if Pokemon was on, and I pressed on Channel 21 into the remote, hoping there was more channels, and to my delight, there was. My dad was surprised too, but he let me watch it because it seemed to have kids program on. The channel was called Caledon Local 21, and later I found out it was indeed broadcasted from the town of Caledon, Ontario, a town very close to my city. The shows I saw on Caledon Local 21 looked poorly made, and I never understood what was going on in them half the time. However, as I grew up, every time I thought of the channel, I realized more and more how messed up the show was. And I had to ask myself, what the fuck was I watching? The following is a list of shows and episodes I remember seeing on Caledon Local 21. How I remember such detail even disturbs me, but I guess things like this stand out in your mind for a while. The channel only ran a few shows, probably because it was only operational between 4 PM and 9 PM. Mr. Bear Cellar episode 12, very sketchy name if you were to look it up nowadays. The show featured a guy wearing a bear mascot costume who would get a new visitor into a cellar every day. It was always a kid. The show was filmed with a camcorder, not a very good one either. The police asked me a lot of questions about this show. The episode started with Mr. Bear sitting at a table, playing checkers by himself. He sat there playing for a bit until there was a knock on the door. The camera was then looking up the stairs at the door where there was another knock. Mr. Bear climbed the stairs and opened the door to reveal two young children. One was a boy about my age, and the other was a girl who looked about 8 years old. Mr. Bear danced in delight and then started talking to the kids. I couldn't hear any of them that well. I remember Mr. Bear then led the kids into the cellar, which is quite dark, only lit by a small oil lamp on the table. I can't really remember that much more, except him singing a song which I couldn't hear too well either. Probably because of the large bear mask. The episode ended with them playing hide and seek with the kids hiding in the closet and Mr. Bear counting. Next, there was something called Soup and Spoon. I don't think this was even a show. I think it was more of a special movie type thing. All I know is I stopped watching Caledon Local 21 for a while because I thought this show was too stupid, especially since Pokemon Now came on at 4:30 and 5. I don't remember much of this, but it showed a can of soup and a spoon both attached to strings, swinging back and forth as if someone was holding them and dangling them in front of the camera. Interestingly enough, the show was shot in a basement which looked just like the one used in Mr. Bear's cellar. Like I said, I can't remember much, but the only thing I can remember clearly was the end. The entire thing was only half an hour and just included stuff I found stupid, such as the spoon chasing the soup around trying to eat him, and the ending showed a table and about 7 kids sitting around it, each with a bowl of soup in front of them. They were sitting and looking at the camera but with confused, almost frightening faces. The cameraman then held the can of soup in front of the kids and said, "Spoons ready," and then it just stopped. It was summer and I hadn't watched Channel 21 for a while, until one day when I slept over at my friend's house, I decided to check it out again. My friend had gotten a TV in his room for his 6th birthday, so we stayed up very late. For us, 9:30 was very late, and watched TV. That's when I remembered Channel 21 and brought it up to my friend. We decided to see if it was on, and to our surprise, it was. They must have changed the broadcasting time. Mr. Bear's Cellar, episode 23. This episode was entertaining for my friend and me, mainly because it had swearing. However, now when I think of this episode, I realized something was definitely wrong when it was filmed. The episode started with the camera on its side, while it was facing Mr. Bear, who was walking upstairs to the cellar door. The camera then blacked out for about a second before fading in back upright and facing Mr. Bear. There was also another kid talking to him, but this kid looked about 11 or 12. He was talking to Mr. Bear for a while, but I couldn't hear well, again because of the crappy camcorder, until the kid started raising his voice. The kid was saying how it was late and his sister had to go home. You could also hear more voices in the background. I remember Mr. Bear clearly saying, "Get the fuck out, you're not invited," with a deep voice muffled by the bear mask. I remember my friend and I looking at each other and laughing at the mention of the forbidden F word, but the episode got weirder. The kid began climbing the stairs before turning around and saying how he was going to call the police. Mr. Bear began breaking into a run towards the kid, who started screaming and running as well. The camera then cut out and that was the end of the episode. The channel then turned to static shortly after. I didn't want to watch Channel 21 after that. In August, I grew more curious to see Mr. Bear's Cellar for some reason though. The last episode I saw of Mr. Bear was weird and had swearing, which also made me think the show was meant for teenagers. Nonetheless, I flipped onto Channel 21 when my dad was busy. In episode 28, apparently this episode had been playing the entire month of August. It was studied a lot by the police. The entire episode was just Mr. Bear sitting in a chair talking to the audience. "Hello kids, do you want to visit my cellar? If you do, please write me a letter at this address." The screen then switched to a white screen with multicolored letters, reading the address, and that was what remained for the rest of the episode. This repeated for 5 hours every day until September came. And guess what I actually did? I sent Mr. Bear, or that sick bastard who portrayed him, a letter. I did it out of curiosity mostly. My dad was okay with it because he thought it was a legit kids show. But then again, he never saw any of what was on Channel 21. So I wrote a letter using my best writing possible. I think I just said how I wanted to meet Mr. Bear, so my dad sent the letter to the address Mr. Bear said on the show. It stayed on all day anyway for some reason. It took about a week to get a response, which I was surprised I did. I still have the letter I received on August 15th, 1999. The letter said, "Dear Elliot, thank you ever so much for your letter. I would love to have you in my cellar. We play games, watch movies, and go fire camping in the middle of the woods. Come to my house at," with the police cutting out the address, "Caledon, Ontario, Canada. I look very forward to having fun with you. Love, Mr. Bear." I cannot believe my dad never found this sketchy, but he actually took me to the house, and then that's when the police became involved. Those endless questions, those pictures of terrified kids, the woods, that brings me to why I'm writing this blog. That psycho and his friends did some fucked up shit back then, and now it seems he's trying to get into contact with me again. The entire police thing is coming back. This has brought 1999 back to me. Over a decade later, it is happening again. And those are all the stories that I have talked about today. Yes, those are all of the ones that I'm going to be talking about with this video. Yes, more probably will come. So let's do a quick little recap of the, I guess creepypastas. Zalgo was an interesting one. I felt like the whole importance of Zalgo, of basically this person being the only one to see the truth while everyone else is infected by the monster, is very interesting, and I'm pretty sure has been done to death with various monster zombie movies. But I very much liked the whole Black Tendrils type of thing, but it is kind of reminiscent of the Slender Man. Eyeless Jack, of course, is one of the most infamous ones. A very short story, but a very infamous one, with him just taking kidneys and apparently eating it like some sort of monster. I don't think it's as bad as Jeff the Killer, but it is still pretty, it's not one of the best. Russian Sleep Experiment, I still think is a very good creepypasta. I can definitely see it happening with, those, infamous war type of experiments that they were doing. I'm not saying that this is, of course, real, or that people were going insane and, swearing for God, but definitely a interesting story, and probably one of the best ones right now. Herobrine I never got scared of, and even as a kid I think I was just too old to appreciate it. And as for 1999, apparently there are updates for it. I read the original up till the apparent updates that it got around 2011, 2012, and it basically goes around the story of them trying to find Mr. Bear, and maybe one day they actually did. I don't know, but right now I'm just reading the pure story, and I kind of like the ending of Mr. Bear is actually trying to get me. Very good cliffhanger, but I feel like 1999, I could see why a lot of people like it, but I could also see why a lot of people hate it too. And that's all for today's video. Again, more will be coming out, and yeah, bye.